This podcast is part of the Frederick Podcast Network. Learn more at listenfrederick.com.
Hey everyone, this is Natalie Souders. Thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of Mental Health and Me. When we are pregnant, it is common to have expectations of our birth experience. If you were like me, you were even encouraged to write out a birth plan. You have certain hopes and expectations. Maybe it's based on the experience of others, or maybe it's something you saw on TV, or maybe it's just something you came up with in your head. It's important to me with Mental Health and Me that eventually everybody who tunes into an episode can find something where they connect, can find something that helps them experience some validation in their story. And today, I invited a friend on to the studio named Rachel. How are you doing today, Rachel?
Not too bad. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for being with me and talking about this topic. It's really near and dear to my heart. And the discussion we're going to have today is relating to birth trauma. And Rachel has been so kind, and she agreed to come in and tell her story. And I'm really hoping that it'll help some others who have experienced this and don't know where to go. In my experience, there's just not a lot of information available, and there's not a lot of places where you land after an experience like that. And because it's subjective, it seems like it can even be hard to know if it's okay to label your experience as birth trauma. So Rachel, what would you like to tell us? How would you like to start out? We know birth trauma is a sensitive topic, so I want to make sure to just give you a lot of freedom to share the parts of your story that you're interested in sharing.
Sure. Maybe just for context purposes, I can just kind of start at the beginning in terms of like wanting to have a child and just maybe starting there. And then I can just kind of walk you through the story and, answer questions and, give feedback about, just other folks who have been in a similar boat. And then go from there, if that sounds good.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned you were wanting to have a baby, like a lot of us do. And
Yep.
How did that start out? Did that start out okay?
Yeah, yep. Pretty typical, nothing too exciting. My husband and I, we got married in 2014, and I'd been going to a gynecologist. It was a woman, in our area, and she was no longer doing the baby delivering. So just sort of doing the gynecology, but not the baby delivering. So she handed me off to a colleague of hers. They shared space, but they were like, in separate practices.
Yeah.
So didn't know him. But, she spoke, highly of him. It also turned out that he had delivered my nieces and he had delivered my nephew. So, despite not knowing him super well, I was like, okay, I have some trust. As the pregnancy went on, nothing real crazy, no real surprises. We get to 37 weeks and I went in for just sort of one of your routine appointments. What I will add here is that throughout the pregnancy, he wanted to know a little bit about my husband and, just like what the birth was like for him and what, my birth was like, just to get sort of, I guess, maybe a general picture of like, what have babies been like in the family.
The doctor?
Okay. There was always sort of this like talk about like, oh, so there's like really, really big babies. And, like my husband was a larger baby and his brothers were larger babies. So, That's fine. I didn't think much of it. And then I remember like having some conversations again, like still, I look back and I feel like I was super naive, but I look at it differently looking back than I, felt in the moment. And I remember this conversation where we were talking about like C-sections versus, vaginal births. And I said like, I'm not really married to one or the other. I said, at the end of the day, I just want my baby to be safe and healthy. And I remember he said, oh, that's really great because a lot of women in this area, they're very naturalistic and, they're very obsessed with having like the most natural birth. And I said, I said, I'm easygoing. I said, I just want the baby to be safe. So, I trust you as a doctor, whatever works.
Yeah.
Again, I'm going to highlight this moment because I look back and I'm like, I want to kick myself for saying that because I feel like there's something I should have picked up on there, but in the moment, didn't really think much of these sort of conversations about like C-sections versus and babies and all that. So anyway, fast forward, and that, let me just say that did come up a few times about just sort of emphasizing that I might be having this very large baby.
Mm-hmm.
But it was almost like funny, like, yeah, like, my husband was large,
Right.
no big. But yeah, again, fast forward to that 37-week appointment, when I go home, go to the next morning. So now we're at Friday morning. So the previous Thursday was the day where I go in and, the blood pressure's up and I'm taking it and I'm getting more anxious and the blood pressure's going up. I call him that next morning and I'm like, I don't know, it's still high. I'm really concerned. So then he says, okay, well, you know what? Maybe we need to take the baby now.
Oh, wow.
And I said, okay. And so then, of course, I'm getting concerned and thinking, well, he knows what's best. So I go to the hospital in DC and they have me get all hooked up to the monitors and all the things. And the on-call doc is the one that gets to make the judgment calls for taking a baby. On the way to the hospital, I will not forget this phone call. He says to me, and this is one of two very memorable phone calls. He says, so, we're going to try to take the baby today. And this is Friday morning. If the nurses ask you if you've eaten, because he asked me, have you eaten in the last 8 hours or 12 hours? Because this was going to have to be a C-section because of my blood pressure. And that sounded normal. Oh, okay. And I said, yeah, I had like a muffin around, I don't know, like 12 or 1 a.m. He's like, well, if they ask if you've eaten, just say that you haven't. Okay. So I'm like in crisis though, right? Like my blood pressure's up. I'm going in way earlier. Like, yes, that's weird, but like tried not to like read too much into it. I'm so anxious. I don't know what's nerves and what isn't at this point. So I go in, they hook me up, and guess what? I'm hooked up to all the things and my blood pressure comes down. Why? Because, a lot of it was anxiety based. Ultimately, it sounds like, I later find out it really was just gestational hypertension. I never actually even came close to meeting the threshold for preeclampsia. That's an important thing as well. So I'm in on Friday. Thank God it was, a really great doctor on call. They really don't like to take babies before 39 weeks, if they don't have to. So she sent me home. So I never had the C-section that he was getting ready to give me. So, on one level, my husband and I were like, oh, like we thought we were going to like have the baby.
Yeah.
So go home and, a little shaken out, but like, I'm pretty much like on quote unquote bed rest at that point. Because they just want me to like, be careful. He gives me a call later that day and he says, I just think like in order to keep this baby safe, we're going to want to do a planned C-section. And I said, okay, whatever you think we're going to need to do. Because remember, there's previous conversations where I'd said I was very open to sort of whatever,
Right.
And so we planned for, it was going to be on, a particular day in April. And, that was going to be the plan. And so I was like, okay, like, let's do that. So the next few weeks, I took it easy. Nothing crazy happened. Continued to sort of monitor my blood pressure, but my blood pressure really was fine as long as I just kind of stayed calm and collected and, not anxious. And all was good. I go into the hospital. So I was planning to go in the hospital on this particular day. It was like the night, I think it was planned for the 18th. And then it's about 4:30 or 5 a.m. on the 18th. And all of a sudden I go into labor.
Oh, wow.
And I went into it completely on my own. So this is like 39 weeks in a day. So 39 weeks exactly and a day. And so we were on the way. My best friend met us there as well as my mother-in-law. And so we get there by like 7 a.m. I have really bad back labor at that point, but I'm in active labor. And my body was doing all the things that it needed to do. It was doing this naturally.
Right.
And on the way there, here's the second memorable phone call. And so we are on the way to the hospital and he calls and this is a really weird phone call. And he says, the nurses are probably going to like ask you why you need a C-section. And just make sure you tell them that this is something that you and the doctor discussed and that like you've decided this is what's best. Again, I'm in active labor. I didn't think much of it. Like,
Right.
I, just figured like, this is what I need. Okay. So we go there, I get on the machines, all the things. And I think the C-section is set for like 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock. And so it's all ready to go. And then, like he said, this really, really nice nurse who had ended up like, had actually gone to high school with my husband. There was a funny connection there. She'd asked, she's like, so why are you having a C-section? And I said, oh, like, because the doctor and I, talked about it. And he said like, this was, kind of the only way to keep the baby safe. And she just sort of like looked at me and didn't like kind of endorse or go against it. Just, I don't know. It was a weird interaction. And again, like I'm in the moment there, I don't know what else to do, but I'm like, okay, like, I guess this makes sense. Again, I'm so flustered, so many emotions. I'm about to give birth to my first child.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, the C-section happens, and this is where stuff got very weird. So, and I didn't have a reference point, but I later find out there were some very, very weird things. So again, there's that weird phone call. The nurses are sort of wondering why we're even having a C-section. They did see how far I was dilated, and I think it was dilated like maybe a centimeter or two. So like, again, body was doing what it needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing he had mentioned at some point to me prior to this was like, oh, like sometimes with blood pressure, they put you on this medicine, but it makes you really like wonky. So you don't want that. I later find out that that's actually just a very normal medication they put you on if you do like have preeclampsia. Even with preeclampsia, you can still have a vaginal birth and give birth naturally.
Definitely.
You just have to get on this like sodium something, or I forget what it is. So many weird things that after the fact, I look back and I'm like, he was just pushing these C-sections like no other. I'm going to add in here, I later find out too, this is very, very common for doctors in boutique practices when they are practicing on their own. They get more money for C-sections, and two, they don't want to wait for a woman to labor.
So and that's a really big one, is the rushed labor in our country, is that, it's very normal for it to take hours and hours and hours for this process. And you're right, it's very quick in and out. They don't have the time to deal with you or don't want to.
No. And there's this like blog online called like, I think it's like DC Urban Mom Blog. This is all after the fact, after all the craziness, I later find out that he had a reputation at this DC hospital by the residents. He was known as the Uptown Slasher. Why? Because he had a crazy amount of C-sections scheduled all the time.
Okay.
So the fact that like that's a thing, but again, way later I find this out. And again, things look different when you review back. So I go into the C-section and all seems normal, but I don't have a reference point. I remember being very, very out of it. I remember like hearing a baby crying and not realizing that like it was my baby, like coming out. Like I was so not coherent. And I later find out like that's not normal. Like, if they're going to put something in your IV, they should probably tell you. I don't know what they put in my IV. So I was like not coherent really. I was awake and everything, but not coherent. I was like uncontrollably shaking. And as soon as the C-section is done, Dr. F was covered in blood from head to toe. And he went through the hallway, and my parents and my mother-in-law saw him. It was weird that he was covered from head to toe. C-sections are very, very controlled. And that's weird. My dad got to witness 2 C-sections, me and my brother, and nothing like that. And he was in the room, So that was a little weird, but like my mom jokingly asks, hey, so is it still a boy? Haha. And he says to her, the doctor says to her, I can't share that with you. He's met my mom before. Like, this is weird. He was like sweating. Even my husband noticed he was sweating profusely during it. Like, it was just very weird. Something was very off.
Yeah.
So I get to learn those things later. So I go into the recovery room, and this is a Monday. The next few days are a little murky because I was on a crazy amount of drugs. Within probably the next hour, I start to be in excruciating pain, like excruciating. And again, don't have a reference point. I don't know at that point that that's not normal. I'm in excruciating pain, and they can't seem to get my pain under control. They finally put me on. I remember my brother and my dad trying to help me like move in the bed, couldn't even move myself because I was in so much pain. And then what happened after that? They put me on a Dilaudid drip. So I was so out of it.
Yeah.
To get the pain under control. So then that was Monday. Fast forward to Tuesday. I'm still in a ton of pain. My parents are sort of going in and out of the hospital, still not realizing that this isn't super normal. And then on Tuesday, they were going out from the room to like go get lunch. And then the doctor came in and very casually says to me, "You're going to need a blood transfusion."
Oh, wow.
Wait,
So up to this
like,
point, you were not
oh yeah.
aware that you were not having a normal recovery.
No, I just knew I was in a shit ton of pain and like, whoa, like and Dilaudid. I just remember at one point I asked husband to get me a pillow from the hall closet. And then he was like, we're in the, like, I got super confused about where I was. I mean, it was like very mind altering, this medicine.
Right.
So anyway, I think they had finally lowered the Dilaudid maybe the next day, but the doctor comes in and says, "You're going to need a blood transfusion." I was like, "Oh my God, what?" So I texted my parents immediately. I was like, "Come back. Like, I'm getting a blood transfusion. I don't know what's happening. Oh my God. Oh my God." So then I'm freaking out. Like, what is going on? No one's sharing any information. Like, what the hell is happening? So then I'm told that, and now an hour goes by and I haven't gotten my blood transfusion. So my dad gets, tries to like advocate for me, and he like tries to get a hold of the doctor. Like, she still hasn't gotten her blood transfusion. Like, what's happening? And so like, they take their sweet old time. For some reason on the recovery floor, they couldn't get the damn IV in me. So then they had to take me to the L&D floor to get an IV in. I mean, I literally looked like a drug addict when I came out of the hospital because like they couldn't do these IVs to save their life.
Right.
But anyway, finally got the blood transfusion, and it sounded like I was only going to get a unit. I ended up getting 3 units transfused in the hospital. It took forever. Nobody's following through with me. Nobody's advocating for me except for my, like my husband and my parents and my mother-in-law, like, why isn't she getting this? Why is it taking so long? It ended up going so slow in, and it took like hours into the middle of the night going into Wednesday to even get all the blood in.
So no one at this point had told you why you needed all this blood?
Oh, no. Mm-mm. I mean, you assume it's because my hemoglobin's low, but like, why is my hemoglobin low? No one's sharing anything. Like, what the F is happening? And I really wish that this was where the story ends and this was the worst of it, but it's not. So they come in, So Wednesday, things start to look better. I have some guests Wednesday, Thursday, and then they do release me on Friday. I stayed a few days extra just because of my quote unquote complications, but I ended up being fine. So I get sent home on Friday. I think I'm fine. And things are fine. We're getting used to a baby at home. I struggled with some breastfeeding. That was pretty emotional. I have a lot of emotions about like trying to breastfeed in the hospital, but I couldn't even hold my baby because I was in so much pain. I couldn't even hold my baby those first like day or so because I was like so drugged up. I kept falling asleep and not able to like stay conscious. I mean, so there's a lot of like hurt and pain that I feel around that. And also just like remembering like, that like my baby was like fed formula when like I didn't even like, not that there's anything wrong with formula, and all my babies ended up being mainly formula fed, but like I didn't even have control because I was in so like much like almost like a drug coma kind of. So there's a lot of like kind of trauma from that experience. Anyway, I go home on Friday and I'm like kind of like grieving this idea that I couldn't breastfeed the way that I wanted to. I'm still needing to just be mindful of like the pain I'm in because I had a C-section. Fast forward to the following Wednesday. It's probably like 11 p.m. at night. The baby is sleeping upstairs with my husband. He's getting some rest. My parents are in the kitchen. I get a piece of cheese out of the refrigerator. This is sort of this image I have. I'm getting this cheese out of the fridge. And I walk away from the refrigerator, and all of a sudden I feel a really weird sensation. And all of a sudden I run to the bathroom, and blood is literally gushing out like a faucet. It looked like a murder scene in the bathroom. And like, I don't know what's happening. I scream for my mom. Like, it just keeps coming out, like pouring out. I just can't emphasize that enough. It was like the scariest thing you've ever seen. And my parents are grabbing towels. My mom's like, we need to take you to the hospital. I was like, no, Mom, like, you need to call 911. Like, yeah. I don't know what's happening, but like, it's just pouring out of me. So they're giving me towels to like put between my legs. They call 911. Luckily, I lived 2 to 3 minutes from the hospital in our town. And so the ambulance got there. I even remember being able to I was still like gushing blood, but was somehow able to like walk myself out towards the bed or towards the stretcher.
Yeah.
And then the next things get really blurry at that point. So I get put in the ambulance. My husband follows behind. We get we beeline towards the hospital. I remember going into the room and it felt like it wasn't very crowded, and like it didn't seem like things were happening very quick. And then all of a sudden it went from like that to like 100 people in the room. And like these are sort of some of the last images I have of like.
So at that point, did you realize something was really wrong?
Oh yeah. Well, after the blood gushing out of me, I knew something was really wrong.
Yeah.
And so I remember, and some of this is told to me, but I have vivid images of sort of what happened, where like, this doctor or nurse is like looking at me in my face, and they're leaning me all the way back. They're putting my head all the way back. My husband's in my face, like trying to like, keep me alert. So my head's all the way back. It's this really uncomfortable position. I'm going in and out of consciousness at that point. I think my husband said my blood pressure got to like 50/30. I'd lost like 2/3 of my blood. They called what's called a massive blood transfusion protocol. It was a small local hospital, so they didn't even have enough blood. They had to fly in blood from Washington, D.C. to the hospital to give it to me. Yeah. And so some of the last things I remember is him trying to like keep me alert. And then I think it was in that same room, my dad, like, I think at that point, my dad was like, I just remember like I've literally seen my dad cry twice in his entire life. And like he had tears in his eyes and he was telling me it was going to be okay. But I wasn't sure. And so that was probably like, I think some of my most graphic sort of images that I remember. And then I went into surgery. This is sort of an amusing, I guess it's an amusing part, because I just have this like image of this surgeon coming and he's like, you woke me up out of bed. And I'm like, I think I was conscious at that point because I had enough blood put back in me. I went under again, and then I was intubated for the next 3 days. And I was air-vac'd to a DC hospital. I was kept open. I had my first helicopter ride, and I wasn't even conscious for it. And I ended up getting really, really great care at this excellent hospital in DC. And I'm honestly a case study there because, they were trying to figure out what happened. What ended up happening is that my uterus stitches came undone on all ends. And so my C-section stitches like completely dehisced. I think it was like 3 out of the 4 ends. And then it kind of resulted in what they call a secondary hemorrhage. I also found out later my body went into DIC, which is when like it can't even clot anymore. And so I had a laparotomy at the hospital I was air-vac'd to really figure out like what's going on. And they like double stitched my uterus and all these things. So 3 days later, I wake up, I have a tube down my throat. They I forgot what they call it when they take the tube out. I had no idea. I was communicating with my brother and my husband using a piece of paper. I was like asking things like, writing things like, do I have cancer? Like how, like what happened? I was so confused.
So at this point, you didn't know it was birth related?
Like I was, when they took the tube out, I was like very kind of like disoriented.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I don't know what just happened. Like, I was very, very disoriented. And then I sort of like kind of came back to and sort of understood like what had happened. And then it all sort of came back. And then I had to be there for a week to recover. And then I finally came home. Luckily, they did let my son, remember this is newborn time. Like this is my first child. I'm away from him. They were letting him come to the hospital for a little bit. So like my parents would bring him every day and I could have a little bit of time, but it was really hard. I could barely hold him. And so then I came home, and the next 3 months were kind of a blur. I mean, it's the newborn blur, but it was also just like recovering. I was on meds every day. I was in pain. I could barely hold my child. My maternity leave was completely robbed of me. And so that is the story. My son is totally fine. I am here. I am alive. I went on to have 2 other children, believe it or not. The only doctor no doctors ever want to disparage another doctor, but the only doctor who was ever able to say, someone did something wrong is the anesthesiologist for my second child. He's like kind of wondering about some of the things that were being put in place for me. They put me on this stuff to help me clot just in case. And he, when I told him some of the story, he's like, oh, sounds like operator error. And I said, yeah, it does. I was very angry for a while. It's like, not that money's going to make it better, but money could at least allow me to expand my maternity leave. I was like so horrified. I found out that the doctor lied in the medical record. He said that the reason I wanted a C-section and the reason was for my anxiety, and that the pain of a vaginal birth would have been too much for my anxiety. He actually wrote that in the record.
Wow.
And that was really hard to hear because that was such a lie. I tried to sort of explore lawsuit options. I had a lot of friends sort of encouraged me to go that route. But unfortunately, because I am alive and my son doesn't have brain damage, my son is fine, I am fine. I mean, they can't do anything. They don't care about PTSD. They don't care about trauma. It was just sort of washed under the rug. And so that was really hard too, right? Because that's sort of invalidating. Like, you know, it's like not that bad what happened to me. I almost died. The C-section that I didn't need literally almost killed me. Like, I'm very, very lucky to be here. It's something that doesn't just go away. And actually, I tried to work through my birth trauma soon after I, went through it. I wasn't ready. And it's actually not until this past year I finally connected with a therapist who specializes in birth trauma, and I'm really starting to do some good work. And I'm like, this little baby is turning 7 this year. So, and like I said, I'm here, I'm grateful. I have 2 other kids. It also doesn't take away my experience. I have so much respect for the OB on call that this was something he had never seen before. But he, like him and the general surgeon, I mean, they didn't take my uterus and they could have.
Wow.
My husband had to sign something that he felt so guilty signing, saying that it was okay to take my uterus to keep me alive. And he felt so bad about it. And I'm like, why do you feel bad? Of course I would want you, like, what good would my uterus be if I'm not here? So and they were able to save me and not take it. And I was able to have more children, but I'm very grateful for that. But no, the scars are there. I'm in a lot of survivor, support groups, which has been helpful. I really try to speak out on this topic, just about advocacy. And I've connected with a lot of women. And through that DC Urban Moms thing, I connected with other women who are also victims of him. I've connected with several other women who were forced to have C-sections they didn't need. I connected with someone, just in the last few years who also had some weird monkey business with him. He retired this. I also attempted to file a medical, report, but all that is a notch in the belt, right?
Right.
And at the end of the day, he retired in the last year. So I'm glad that he can't hurt any more people out there, but it's like the scars are, they don't go away. So.
And you said a few things that I really appreciated too, is that, if you're looking from the outside in, if I just happened to have seen you at month 2 sitting at Walmart, I would say, oh, you have what a beautiful baby, right? Like from the outside, nobody really is able to look and say, she just nearly died. She just had an extremely traumatic experience. But, we say, oh, she's a new mom. How awesome.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah. I immersed myself in all the moms groups. I tried to stay active. I think almost like that was my coping mechanism. I was busy. I was working and I was working out and I was, just doing all of socializing and trying to meet other mom friends and doing all the things as a way to just not feel. And I'm aware of that now. It was, a coping mechanism for me. But, just advocacy, self-advocate, ask questions. If something doesn't make sense, ask and ask more and push, be pushy, be the nag, be the person who says, well, are you sure about that?
Right. I think that's the hardest thing is that, sometimes we go in and do instinctively trust medical professionals. And I'm not knocking them. My mom was an RN and I've got a lot of respect for the people who do that. But I do think that we have a gut instinct. And I know that I allowed medical professionals to steer me wrong. And I so regret that, especially with my first child. And I trusted them and they kept telling me, no, it's not a problem. And looking back, now that I have 3 children as well, and I would never just take that as an answer now. I'd be like, nope, schedule it somewhere else because it doesn't sit right with me and I need to be my best advocate.
Yeah, and it and now it's like it's been a learning curve. So you bet, like in those, second and third births, I was asking all the questions. I was advocating, like, what are you doing this for? Why are you doing this? What is this? Does this make sense? Like, even though I trusted these people, but I have such medical mistrust that like I have found amazing providers that listen, but like I'm so skeptical. Like I was never like that before, and it's like, and I have really good friends who are doctors. That's something I'll add to my story. Like my very best friend from high school, she is an OB, and when my parents weren't getting like any information, she was out of state. I believe she finishing up her residency. No, she was past residency at that point. And she was communicating, she had a few connections at this DC hospital. And so she was able to get some of the intel on what was happening with me. And then she was like calling my parents and relaying it to my parents. So it's like, that was one of the saving graces, at least just for my parents, and my husband and our, our other family, like that we had sort of that support and advocacy. And then for consecutive births, I ran everything by her. Does this seem normal? Is this okay? Or even for anything else, my husband recently had a medical, issue come up, and like I was consulting with family doctors. I was like people in my family who are medical professionals. And I said, what do you guys think about this? Does this seem like a good plan of care? I wouldn't have ever really done that before.
Right.
But it's like, I don't trust anyone. Even at the hospital, with my husband, I was like, I need to be like his advocate. I don't trust anybody.
Right.
I want to know what the plan is. Why are you doing this? Yeah. And so it's just sad. And like you hear about it more and more, women are invalidated and they're dismissed. And it's so sad. It is so sad. And, I just think there's more and more media coming out about just maternal morbidity. I mean, there are some really pathetic statistics about the United States. We are not a third world country. Yet why do we have the highest rate of maternal morbidity? Why?
I agree. I think that's really hard. And I've known other people to share very traumatic C-section stories as well, but they don't seem to get to circle back to their own story because you don't get time. Your newborn doesn't care that you just had a traumatic experience, right? Like they need taken care of. And so these women don't, you're running to all these newborn appointments. They don't get a chance to even look at their own story and say, wait a minute, that was like really terrible what I went through.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was, it's hard, and how you give birth anyway, you don't have to almost die to have grief around your birth. And
Yes.
if it's not what you expected, like there's this whole spectrum of this. And like, it's not like I get, a prize because like I almost died. No, like every person who gives birth and their birth does not end up looking like what they wanted it to, has a right to sort of grieve and not be dismissed or invalidated. I think so often people are quick to be like, but at least you're alive. I mean, like I literally did get some feedback like that, but you're alive.
Yikes. Yeah.
Your son's here and he's alive. And so it's like, stop, kind of moaning about the fact that like your maternity leave was robbed of you and that like I couldn't hold my baby in those like initial hours of his life. I mean, I missed crucial moments. And again, like I have a great bond and attachment with my son. And I love him to death, but like, it's not easy. And, it's like, trauma leaves a footprint. Like I threw him this like crazy first birthday party, more so because like the month of April, like is really, really hard for me. And like, it still is, like I don't mind it as much. And I try to do some like good things for myself. I usually have like a run scheduled or, something like that. But, it's like those things don't go away.
Right.
Yeah. And it's hard. So I think, just my advice to people out there who've gone through something similar is like, honor your story, honor your feelings, whether you are a week out from something like this or 10 years out, it doesn't matter. I talk about this in my survivors group a lot. Like, it's like, you can feel like you're so like far from it. And then it's like something happens and you're like right back there. The littlest thing, it could be a helicopter. It could be something, like for a long
a
time.
trigger
I
for
was
sure.
Yeah. For a long time, I was obsessed with medical dramas on TV, and I had to stop watching those for a while. There was like, my husband and I were watching like the other day, and all of a sudden this woman was talking like almost like passed away during birth. And so of course, like even today, like again, I'm almost 7 years out, and it's still like I found myself getting some tears in my eyes, and I like sort of just like kind of, let it simmer, and then I was fine. I don't have like, I know I teared up today because again, I'm human. But I think like, it's okay to own your emotions. And even if you are 10 years out or however many years out you are from something like this, it's okay to sort of still have emotions and feelings around it. And, don't have anyone put a timeline. That goes for any kind of trauma. Like there's no timeline on your healing. And so I'm always, again, I'm still gentle with myself in April, and maybe that'll always be the case, or maybe eventually, maybe April will feel like less of a thing, but
time will tell. Well, thank you, Rachel, so much for coming into the studio with us today. Thank you for sharing your story. I really do appreciate your time, and I hope that this really helps other women feel validated.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So thank you, Rachel, for spending some time with me today and talking about birth trauma. That's such a sensitive topic, and I really hope that our listeners can connect with your story. As always, if you are a listener and felt that this was something that was triggering, or you felt like you had a similar experience, please reach out to a mental health professional. Thank you for tuning in to Mental Health and Me, sponsored by the Listen Frederick Podcast Network, and look me up on Instagram at @NatalieSouders_. Until next time.
Live radio, local podcasts, the Frederick Podcast Network at listenfrederick.com.